Hi, this is Tamara from mooglyblog.com, and in this video I'm going to be demonstrating how to make the Seaglass Summer Cardi. It's a free pattern that you'll find on mooglyblog.com. Please go to the link in the video description where you'll find a link to the rest of the tutorial, including right and left-handed versions, all the supplies you need, and the written pattern itself, which you will need to make this pattern. It is made with Red Heart It's a Wrap Rainbow. We need 2 balls, or rather cakes, since that's the style that this yarn comes in, as well as a USK hook. This one is made by Clover. You'll also need scissors, a yarn needle, and some stitch markers are really helpful too. These are also made by Clover. Now, I used the Seaglass colorway, which you can see right here, to make my Seaglass Summer Cardi, but there are lots of other fun colorways in this yarn too, like this nautical one and Fiesta, which I think are both really beautiful, and I really hope to be able to see some of these patterns made with them very soon. So let's go ahead and get started making our Seaglass Summer Cardi. Now here you can see some pictures of me in the Seaglass Summer Cardi. It's a little big to all get on screen on a table, but this shows you what it looks like. We use 1 cake of the Red Heart It's a Wrap Rainbow to make the back, and another cake to make the front. It's a one-size-fits-all pattern fitting up to a 68-inch bust. So let's go ahead and take a closer look at it now. Okay, and here it is, sort of close up. It's crocheted from the top down. As I say, first you make the back, and the color gradient goes all the way to the bottom of the garment. Then we come back to the top and attach to make the fronts, which you can kind of see right here. There's 1/2 front and 1/2 front right here, and I'll have a smaller version here in a few minutes to show you too. And then after you've done all the crocheting of the pieces, you just work a single crochet border all the way around, and that's made with the end of the yarn, so that's why it's that last color going all the way up around. So like I said, I know that's a little hard to see here on camera. I just want to give you a little tiny tour before we look at the individual stitches. Now you can finish this 2 ways. I finished it off as a cardi by putting just a little 4-inch seam at the waist on both sides. Some people have mentioned that they prefer a Ruana style, which means you just don't have to do this seaming. Just leave it open on the sides, and you can absolutely wear it that way as well. So now let's take a look at the actual stitches themselves. Okay, here I have a small swatch I've made of the stitch pattern. You can see there's a fair bit of stretch in this pattern, which really helps with the one-size-fits-all part. And it's very simple stitches, all double crochets, solid rows, and then mesh rows. And I've marked that very last stitch of the first row, which will come in handy later. Now, when I made this pattern, I used foundation double crochet for the first row, and then I used some special stitches, well, one special stitch in particular called the chainless starting double crochet at the beginning of each row after that. So you could use the standard chain 3 instead of the chainless starting double crochet, and you could chain and double crochet instead of using foundation stitches, but I'm going to show you those stitches because I think it just leads to a nicer finished result. So I do have separate tutorials for the foundation double crochet as well as the chainless starting double crochet, but I'm just going to go over those a little bit quickly right now so we can go over the basic stitch pattern. There's no shaping in the Seaglass Summer Cardi. It's really just a bunch of rectangles, so that makes it pretty darn easy. So I don't think I'll need to demonstrate all the actual stitches. I won't need to stitch the whole thing for you to see how it comes together. So to make a foundation double crochet row, what you're going to do to start the very first one is start with a chain of 2. Now these 2 little chains will not count as our first stitch. So I'm going to yarn over, and I'm going to go into the first chain made right there, the furthest one from the hook, and I'm going to go into that back loop. Not the back loop when you talk about front loop, back loop, but the back hump rather, the third hump there, that bottom part of the chain. Like so, and pull up a loop. Now that loop I've just pulled up, this one right here, that's going to work as the bottom of our first foundation double crochet as the chain that would be at the bottom of a stitch normally in a first row. So then I yarn over and pull up 1 loop through that loop, and that's like beginning our double crochet. So to finish our double crochet, I yarn over and pull through 2, and then I yarn over and pull through 2 again. And that's the first foundation double crochet made. To make subsequent foundation double crochets, I'll yarn over again, and I'm going to come back to the bottom of that first one I made, or the previous one, and I'm going to go under the 2 loops that I told you counted as that chain. Remember when we pulled up that first loop, that left 2 loops behind like there, just looks like you were working to the top of a stitch. Those are the chain for the previous stitch. So we go in there and pull up a loop to make a chain for this stitch. Then we yarn over and pull through that first loop to start our double crochet, and then we yarn over, pull through 2, and yarn over and pull through 2. And we just continued doing that, just like this last one here, for the entire first row. So for the first row, you want to have 109 foundation double crochets. If you choose not to use the foundation stitches and you just want to chain and double crochet, that's fine. You can count the first 3 as your first stitch. You can just do 2, count those not as a stitch. However you prefer to do it is fine. The point is just to have 109 double crochets at the end of the first row. Other than that, if you want to change the actual beginning method, it is totally up to you. And the goal here, 109 is what I went with to make a one-size-fits-all. If you wanted to make it a little bit wider or narrower, you may want to adjust the way the color layout works for the front, and you'll need to figure that part out because that was probably one of the tougher things about designing this pattern. But ultimately, you just really need to have an odd number of stitches to make this pattern work. So I'm not going to do 109, or we would be here quite a while. Doing foundation stitches I find does take a little bit longer than just chaining and working double crochets in there, especially when you've got a little bit trickier yarn like this. You'll notice that It's a Wrap Rainbow is made of 4 strands, sort of loosely held together. So you want to make sure you use the entire strand there. You don't end up splitting the yarn if possible. There we go. So let's see how many of these I've got here. Hopefully it's an odd number. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Nope, we need one more, and then I can continue demonstrating the actual stitch pattern here. So there we go. We've got an odd number of double crochets. If we were making the full size garment, we'd be going with 109, but I'm just going to make a little swatch here to demo the stitch pattern. So to begin the next row, I'm going to start with a chainless starting double crochet. And again, if you don't like this stitch or you don't like using it, you can just start with a chain 3 instead. I'm going to pull up my loop to the height of a standard double crochet, secure it with my finger, wind it around my hook, go into that first stitch, yarn over, pull up a loop. Notice I'm still got my finger on top there to keep it secured. Yarn over, pull through 2, yarn over, go ahead and release, and pull through those last 2 loops. And that will count as the first double crochet of that row. Then, since this is going to be a mesh row, I'm going to chain 1, skip the next stitch, and double crochet in the stitch right after that. And just work on across with the same way. Chain 1, whoops, gotta watch, keep an eye on this yarn, chain 1, skip 1, double crochet in the next. And just all the way across. And if you're making this full size, of course, instead of this tiny little swatch size, you'll have 55 double crochets at the end of this row. So remember that chain 2 there with our foundation stitches doesn't count as a stitch. So with our tiny little swatch, that's all the way across. And that's it for row 2. And indeed, every even numbered row of this pattern is exactly the same way. You work whatever double crochet version you like there, then chain 1, skip 1, double crochet in the next, on across. Then every odd numbered row is going to begin the same way with a chainless starting double crochet or chain 3 if that's what you prefer, right in that first stitch. And again, I have a separate tutorial for this that I have linked out in the tutorial for this pattern that you can go over if you need some more help with that stitch. And then to continue the odd numbered rows, we're just going to work a double crochet in each chain space and a double crochet in each stitch all the way across. So the stitch count for rows 3, 5, 7 all the way through the rest of the back is the same as the stitch count for row 1. We're back to 109 stitches total. So we're just going to continue on across here and then just continue in pattern. Whoops. Like I say, you do need to take a little bit of time with this yarn, but I love the end result and I think it was totally worth it. So there we are. So that is it. That is really the stitch pattern. It's just solid rows of double crochet, solid rows of, followed by rows of mesh, not so solid. The chain 1, skip 1, double crochet, on and on until you get to the bottom of the back. So for the back, this is going to be our tiny little substitute back. You will work a total of 57 rows and you'll end on a row 3 repeat. You want to end on a nice solid row of double crochet. Now, I'm 5'8", so you can see in the pictures how this garment fits me. If you want it shorter, no problem, just eliminate some rows. Just don't work for quite as long. If you want it a little bit longer, there is about this much yarn left at the end of both skeins, so you could probably add a few more rows, but not a whole ton more. You may want to buy another skein of yarn if you really, really want to keep going. So that is about all there is to making the back portion of the Seaglass Summer Cardi. Essentially, you're going to use almost all of your first cake and then set aside that little bit left over at the end. I'm going to go ahead and cut this little bit off because now I'm going to show you how to add the front sections. So I will just get this little tiny swatch we were working on there out of the way. And then I'm going to pick this one up again. And again, this is a tiny little Barbie-sized version, but I want to be able to get it all on camera here so you can really see how it comes together. Now, this was my first row, and I put a tip in the written pattern here. At the end of your first row, it's a good idea to put a stitch marker in the very last stitch you made. So whichever direction you were working, because if you're working foundation double crochet, you'd be going this way. If you were working double crochets into chain, you would have been working the other way. But you just want to make sure that you have a stitch marker there in that the bottom of that very last stitch you made in the first row. Okay, so that's going to help us know where to join to start doing our fronts, because then we're going to turn it around and we're going to work into the base of the first row of stitches we made. So if this was a full-size piece, this would be back at my blue edge starting from the center of my cake, and this would be the green bottom edge of my cardi. So right back up here at the top, we're going to start working into the marked stitch. So I'm going to use just my little leftover bit of yarn here, but if I were making this full size, this is where I'd be starting a second cake. And the reason it's important to do this is because there's a specific way we're going to be cutting the yarn and moving back and forth between the two front halves to maintain the color gradient so that it matches the back. It's not an exact match, but it's darn close. And absolutely one of the things that was one of the challenges and one of the joys of making this pattern. So to begin our first front here, we're going to begin with our right front. If you are right-handed, and I believe it would end up being your left front if you're left-handed. So bear with me, give me a little bit of feedback, left-handed people, and let me know if that's how it works out for you. The point is to start in that marked stitch. So I'm going to go ahead and take the stitch marker out of the way because I know that's where I'm beginning, and I'm going to start with another different stitch here, a standing double crochet. Now, if you prefer, you can just join with a slip stitch and chain up, but I like to begin with this one. I'm going to yarn over twice. You can see I'm holding the tail end of my yarn here in my hook hand and my non-hook holding fingers. Then I'm going to go right into that stitch, the base of that last stitch of the first row, and I'm just going to yarn over and work a double crochet like so. And then before I let go of that tail, I'm going to go ahead and make my next double crochet in my next stitch like so. And then I can let go of that tail end, and I know it won't go anywhere. So that just gives me another stitch, sort of like the chainless starting double crochet, that looks a little bit more like a regular double crochet than a chain. Again, totally optional. So then I'm just going to continue working double crochets on across the base of that first row of the back here to begin our first shoulder, so to speak, our first front side. But I don't want to work all the way across because it's got a split front. We only want to work a total of 55 double crochets across. Now, obviously, I've got a tiny little swatch here, so I'm not going to be going quite that far, but I want to go halfway. So remember, we had 109 double crochets in this row we're working into. So we want 55 in this. That gets us just right into that center stitch. So on our little swatch, I think I had 15 stitches. Let me see here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Remember that little chain 2 we've got there at the start of our foundation, double crochets does not count as a stitch. So 15 cut in half would be 7.5, so I know I need 8 because I want to land in the middle stitch. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, one more. And that is my center stitch. Again, if you're making this full size, it's actually stitch number 55. It's just because I'm making this little doll-sized version. There we go. that I'm stopping right there. So that's the center stitch. So to continue on with the rest of the front, I'm going to continue working in pattern. Now that's back to our solid rows and mesh rows, but I want to break my yarn and work back and forth. So I'm just going to make another row here so you can see a little bit how this comes together, but this is just back to our mesh row. I'm just going to leave the rest of that row right here unworked and save this for the other half of the front. Now if I were making this with a different yarn for some reason and it had solid colors, if it didn't have this gradient, or if I perhaps wanted to mix it up and I didn't want to use the gradient, I didn't want to match the front and back, then I could just continue and work 57 rows again, just like the back for one side, and then join and do 57 rows on the other side for the other front. So you don't have to break it if you're not using the gradient yarn. However, to maintain the gradient, that's what I'm going to be doing here. So if I'm making the full size Cardi, I'm going to work basically in this established stitch pattern back and forth in rows for 6 rows, and then I'm going to break the yarn and come back over and do the left front. Before I do that, let me show you, I've actually printed out a copy of the pattern here using the print friendly button. And I just wanted to show you a little bit about how this is written. So when we begin the front of the Cardi, you can see here's the instructions for the second cake. And there's a right front row on through, and we're going to work in pattern, basically our solid rows and then mesh rows, just as before, through the 6 rows. So the first 6 rows on the right side, or again, the left side if you're left-handed, and then you break the yarn. And then we're going to come back over and join for the other front. So we're just going to be moving back and forth. The first front, that we just go to 6 rows, and then after that, every time we're going to do to 12 rows. So 12 rows on the left, then another 12 rows on the right, brings us to 18, another 12 rows on the left, bring us to 24, another 12 rows on the right, which would bring us to row 30, back and forth, just back and forth, left and right. And that's going to give us that gradient color change to match the back of our Cardi. When we get all the way to the bottom, in order to get 57 rows on both the right and the front, we'll end up working just, I think it's 9 rows on one and then 3 rows on the other. But this is where you want to make sure to print out your instructions, and then you can check off as you go. So you can just stay really in pattern. So I'm just going to demonstrate at this point, since as I mentioned, the actual stitch pattern, the actual stitches is all the same, how you join to begin that second half. So let's imagine for a minute that I've gone ahead and made 6 rows on the first front here. I'm just going to pull some more yarn up here. It's getting a little messy right here at the end of the skein. Thankfully, we don't have to go all the way to the end of the cake when we're making this pattern, because the yarn does want to get tangled here right at the very end. So I'm just going to finish that off just as if I had done 6 rows. And then I want to come back here. Remember when we started that first row, when we joined this front right there, we want to make sure to keep working the same side, the same direction. So like I could start on the other side, but then I'd be working in different directions and it would just be a little visually different. So to join our second half of front here, I'm going to pick up the yarn again, and I'm going to do another one of those standing double crochets. Again, a separate tutorial is linked for that in this tutorial. So I'm just going to yarn over twice, then I'm going to go right back into that same stitch. So that 55th stitch where we ended our previous one is where we're going to start this one. So now I have dropped my end. There we go. So I'll just go ahead and put my double crochet right there, and then you continue to double crochet across that base of that first row again. So right back in there, and then that's just how we begin our second half. So when we begin our second half of the Cardi, that will be 12 rows. And I know that seems a little weird. We start one side off with 6 and the other side with 12. But when I, oops, got a little tangled there. When I laid out the back, I made the back portion of this first. And when I laid it out, I noticed that the major, most distinguishable color changes happened approximately every 12 rows. So in order to split that evenly and minimize the number of cuts you have to make in the yarn, it worked out best to actually do 6, then 12, 12, 12, 12, 12, back and forth, ending up again with 57 rows eventually on each side. So that's really it. Like I say, you work across, and then I would, chain up or use the chainless starting double crochet and do a mesh row, back and forth, just back and forth, back and forth. Once you've got 57 rows made on both your fronts again to match the back, that's when it is time to lay it out and block it and do your seaming if desired. So I'm just going to go ahead and cut it right here. Again, for the sake of time, since you've seen me double crochet, I imagine, enough times now. The actual stitch pattern itself, pretty darn simple. So when you've gotten both of those long fronts made, there'll be 2 long pieces there, you can just fold those forward like so, and those become your shoulders, and they will lay right on top. So you can block this whole thing out to a good size rectangle. I like to block it to 34 inches wide and 36 inches long. Okay, so there's a schematic in the written pattern. Again, follow the links in the descriptions. And let me pull up the finished one here to show you where the seams lie. Okay, so here we've got the full size one again. And you can see, hopefully right here, this was the first row of our back, and then this was the first row of our fronts. We worked one and then the other. Then when I got to the bottom of the final front side I made, rather than breaking the yarn after making that final row, you can just chain 1 and start working all the way around. And I went all the way up one side, down into here, and when I got to this center here, hopefully you can see, in between my 2 fronts, when I was working my edging, I just worked 1 stitch into the final stitch on the final double crochet there into the side of that one. Then I hopped right over to the double crochet that began the first row of the second side and continued all the way around. So after I had added all that edging, of course, it's still a ruana at that point. It's still a ruana style if that's what you like. But I wanted to add some side seams just to add a little bit more structure to it. So if you look up here, this is the fold. We started in the center of the cake where it's the pale blue and worked all the way down. And then right along the side here, if you look at the schematic, 13 inches from the top fold, so our top first 2 rows of both the front and the back folded over, is where I put the side seams right here. And that is just a simple whip stitch done with a yarn needle. So you just go in 1 stitch and out the other. Whip it right through. Again, I have a separate tutorial for the whip stitch seaming. And also in the written pattern, I specify that this is rows 20 through 26. So counting from the top, where we began, both front and back, rows 20 through 26 are where you want to seam those. It's about 4 inches long. So if your gauge ends up being a little bit different, if you're using more of the measurements, then you just want to measure down 13 inches from that top shoulder fold and seam for about 4 inches. And then I left the rest open just for a really easy to wear cardi. Nice and lightweight, perfect for summer. And I will tell you, when I blocked this, I went ahead and soaked it. I put it in a big bucket of water. I got it really good and soaked. I rolled it in just a bath towel lightly. I still left it really good and soaked when I pinned it out. And I will tell you, this thing dried so fast. It dried basically overnight, which I think, considering it was pinned out on a foam board, is really, really good. So I think this is going to be a great swim cover-up, and I think it also, of course, looks fantastic over pants, a shirt, a nice dress, whatever you like to wear it with. These colors are just so beautiful, and with the different colors of Red Heart It's a Wrap Rainbow, you can really make some beautiful garments. So I hope you'll give the Seaglass Summer Cardi a try. You've seen the stitching now. It's very simple. You've seen how it comes together. If there's something I missed, if there's some questions you have, please leave them in the comments. I'll be happy to help. Again, go to the link in the description so you can get the right and left-handed versions, the written pattern, and all the supplies you need. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this video helps you make your own Seaglass Summer Cardi, and I hope you'll share your pictures with me. If you do, share them on social media. Please be sure to tag @MooglyBlog or #MooglyBlog so I can see them too. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. Let us know what you think in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe and click on that bell button so you can get notified every time there's a new video on Moogly Blog. Thank you so much.